Hi everybody, my name is Ben Taylor and on behalf of the English Lab, this is a video that we've titled Text in 10, where we're looking to spend approximately 10 minutes going through some of the key ideas from some of the comparative pairs in order to equip you with some really insightful ideas that you can use as you read through them and as you get yourself prepared for the SACs and the exams that will follow. Today we're looking at the 7 stages of grieving and the longest memory, and I'll take you through what we think are the 3 key things that you really need to be considering in order to take your analysis and your comparison further. And so our first idea, the first thing that we want to look at, is going beyond just merely identifying racism and oppression. Of course, this is the dominant theme that exists between these two texts, and we can see the profound impacts of racism and oppression upon people. But we need to make sure that we're not just dealing in identification of this, and that our essays are saying more than just simply that racism exists within these two worlds. So how do we go further? We start asking questions about it, and we start to look at the experience, the reactions, and the impacts of racism and also of oppression upon a person. And so when we start to think of it in this manner, we start to open ourselves up to some really fantastic comparison, because we can take the experiences of characters from either text and we can start to draw out some differences as well as some similarities in the way in which racism and oppression can impact on a person and how they perceive themselves. So when we look at this, we can look at things from the 7 stages of grieving, such as how the woman talks that they've been taught to cry silently and that she feels numbed, that she feels nothing. However, there's also emotions of reactions of fighting against things, and that tragic part where she talks about her heart hardening. And so we have this range of emotions that are experienced by the Indigenous Australians as shown by the woman. And we can look at this in comparison to Whitechapel and the manner in which he discusses how he feels that he is insufficient, and that he has been brought to a point where he feels that it is best to accept his fate, and that a good slave knows what to do, and a good slave, doesn't question his master, and so on. Such is the profound impact that has been had through this awful treatment that he's been subjected to, that he feels that he is insufficient, that he feels like he's not enough, and that he feels that he is less than as a person. And so when we start to look at these things, there are other characters as well. And of course, within the longest memory, we see Whitechapel and his son having these very different views. And so we can start to look at whether we accept these things or to rebel against them, and which is best for these people, or not even so much which is best, but how the different ways that they work out. Essentially, when we're looking at this idea, I just want to encourage you to make sure that you're asking questions about the racism and the oppression that is there, so we're not just merely pointing out that it exists, but rather pointing out why it exists, how it exists, and how it impacts upon people differently, because that's where you're going to be able to start to draw some really fantastic comparisons from. Of course, there are different ways in which it is shown, and in the longest memory we of course have these overt and very brutal, violent examples of racism. And whilst that might not be shown in the longest memory, of course we know that Indigenous Australians have gone through a history of brutal and violent treatment as well. But whilst that might not be shown in the 7 stages of grieving as much as it is in the longest memory, we still do have other examples. And when we have passages such as Murray gets a dress, this idea that racism can be overt and violent and brutal, but it can also be subtle, and that it can be constant, and that it is a mixture of all of these things that can lead to have an impact on a person's soul and the way in which they view themselves. And so for our second idea, we want to look at comparing not just what is being said across both of these texts and the views and the values and the ideas being presented by these authors and playwrights, but rather how it's been put together. So we want to take a look at perspectives and the different perspectives that are shown, and the way in which these can be seen in different lights, and how you can add more perspective and more depth and more sophistication and insight to your writing if you can compare the construction of text as well as just the messages and the ideas. And so when we take a look at this, we're thinking about things like in the 7 stages of grieving and how the woman is symbolic of the Indigenous Australians' experience, and that there are this range of experiences for her, and that there are the very somber poems and so on that are read. There is the teaching and the educating and, you know, telling the story as it was told to her, all the way through to the comedic style and then the police report. So there's these range of different methods that have been used by Enoch and Mailman as a way to get across these ideas, and we can start to analyze them in the way in which they may have been done and why they may have been done. Of course, we always need to consider that these things have been done for the audience that is viewing the play, and never lose sight of the fact that this is a play, and we need to be able to discuss some of the symbols that have been used, things like bridges and the suitcase being filled with land, and the circles and the cycle. All of these stage directions and all of these things are there for us to analyze, and to analyze in comparison to the longest memory. I want you to think about what the audience is led to feel as a result of these things as well, and whether we are being asked to sympathize, or perhaps to empathize, or perhaps even to learn. Quite a lot of what happens in the 7 stages of grieving is about education, and we'll cover that in a bit more depth with our third idea. When it comes to the longest memory, we all again have a range of perspectives, but they're all shown through different people. And this way we even get the view of the plantation owner. So we even have the voice of the oppressor. On top of that, as long as seeing the justifications or whatever they may see in their mind as these plantation owners, we also have the voice of the Virginian, that dominant voice of the time that leads to the written editorials that outline the attitudes that were prevalent at the time, and of course that being the dominant culture and the dominant attitude that existed. Where we can start to look at this in comparison to the 7 stages of grieving is in the scene where we have the police report, and that the actress is encouraged to ad-lib about who the person really was, as opposed to how the society saw them with their full name and so on. And a really telling phrase, I think, is where it says it returns to the written word. It's this idea that even though we may not have any inclusion of characters that are symbolic of white Australia or any white Australian characters within the play, this idea of returning to the written word shows that dominance of culture and that dominance of how history has been seen and how the world is still seen when we have a dominant culture and one that is oppressed. And so when we look at that in similarity, we can take a look at the Virginian and what it says and the words of a dominant culture, but the different ways in which these things are expressed. That leads us to our third idea, and that is of hope, and whether there is any hope that exists within either of these texts. Of course, we don't get the feeling from either of them of a great sense of optimism, or that this is something that has been solved or something that has been brought to a point where it is now acceptable. But there is a startling difference between the sense of a flicker of optimism that exists within the 7 stages of grieving by the ending of the play, with the people at the train station moving along. And the idea is that there feels like there is progress. The symbolism of people walking across bridges means that perhaps we are getting to a point where people are beginning to understand and reach this new level of understanding. Of course, we don't want to be simplistic in our understanding of that in saying that it is all hopeful. There is obviously many things that are involved in this that lead us to think that there's a long way to go. However, that is something that we can see differently from the play to what we can with the novella. Another interesting idea when we look at it with The Longest Memory is to link hope to education, and to think about what these texts are saying about education in terms of The Longest Memory, where, he heard a choir upon, seeing him read and his finger going along the page. And we can see that the power of education exists in both of these texts. Unfortunately, in The Longest Memory, in the manner in which it is withheld from people, in that in order to keep people subdued and in order to continue this cycle of oppression, we have an understanding of characters that have education withheld from them. And we can see this in a slightly different light within the 7 stages of grieving. There's anger, as the woman points out, what does it mean when some people can't even read or write the word, when she's talking about reconciliation. And so there is this clear idea that for there to be hope, that education needs to be a part of that. And so we can start to link these two things and start to think about where these things are headed and what link hope has to education and how people might be able to move beyond their current understanding. Again, when we're looking for differences between the texts, the education that is withheld from the characters in the longest memory can be seen in contrast to the education that is given to some of the audience members, as well as the sense of faint optimism that might exist amongst the people in the 7 stages of grieving. And so there are 3 key ideas. Of course, there are many more things that could be said about both of these texts. And of course, there are many different ways that these texts can be thought about. The main reason we put these 3 together for you today is to get you started on having an understanding about how you can view these texts and different ways in which you can interpret them. If you have any questions, please put them down in the comments section. Our aim with these YouTube videos is to be as supportive and interactive as possible. So if there's anything from today's video that you feel like you'd like to get more out of, put something down there in the comments and we'll get to it. Also, if you have any comments about today's video, any feedback or anything that we missed out, perhaps there's something that was said today that you think, actually, I see it a different way and you'd like to challenge it. We welcome that because we understand that this is about you thinking about these texts in many different ways. We are going to have other videos looking at these 2 texts, looking at things such as sample paragraphs and ways to respond to essay questions and things like that. So there will be subsequent follow-up videos. We'll also be looking at Section A text that you may be studying, as well as language analysis and how we can get ourselves ready for the English exam. So if you'd like to be keeping on top of all of those things and to be receiving notifications about our future videos, please just subscribe to the channel, and that way you'll be kept on top of all of those things that are coming up. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and share it with other people that you know that are studying these 2 texts. And of course, as I said before, make sure you get involved down in the comments section so that we can help you out further. Thanks very much for watching and all the best with your future studies.